morning. That was very responsive. Well done.
Yo, Paul, great to see you.
Thanks.
Can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Excellent. It's great to be here. I will try not to suck. That's my commitment. How are we? Excellent. Okay. Last year when I was here, my wife, whom I love dearly and is sitting there in the corner, pointed out that I had developed an unhealthy fascination with the word interestingly. So I used it quite often and frequently throughout. So my goal for this morning is, it is a good word, is to try and get through without defaulting back to interestingly. So if at any point that I do, please feel free to ping me on it. It'll keep everyone awake. Today there are some great sessions on individual science fiction artefacts and their significance and what they mean. What we're going to do for a little bit of time now is take the broader view of sci-fi as a genre. So we're not so much going to target on a specific artefact, we're going to broad scope it. In the beginning, the universe was created. This made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. When we think about contemporary popular culture, we can become quite focused on what it means for us now in this moment. The interesting thing is it spans a very diverse... Man, that didn't even get through the first minute. I'm going to keep a tally. All right, we're up to 1. Let's see if I can make through with a minimum of 5. That's going to be my target. How's that? Excellent. Cultural mythology, that's where we were. So cultural mythology, before reading and writing was a thing, and I don't know about you, I like doing things verbally, so if I could have done my thesis verbally, that would have been great. So before reading and writing was a thing, people were sharing stories about the basic necessities of life. And it was a way to form a sense of community, it was a way to warn of danger, it was a way to build a sense of who we are. So cultural mythology began before you actually had any formalised religions or mythologies from a cultural perspective. So you have essentially individuals telling stories, and then over time that has spread to distinct mythologies. And Christianity is very much a part of that tradition. What occurred at some point in time is Western thought became quite linear between myth and religion. And the divide essentially won around fact or fiction. So Christianity was considered to be true and something that was to be followed, believed, something that you could construct systems and groups around, where myth were the quaint traditions of other cultures that are essentially untrue. So often when we think about contemporary religion and myth, we see them as two quite distinct objects, but that's not how they started and that's not what they really are. So does anyone know, anyone who I talked to this morning can't jump in at this point. Anyone want to take a punt on the first sort of recognised science fiction text? Close? So Frankenstein was the earliest, Time Machine, the others came after. There is something that predates... Utopia? Something that predates that. Okay. First recognised science fiction text was written in 200 AD by a chap named Lucian, who was a Greek writer, and he wrote a text called A True Story. Now, about that time, what Lucian was trying to do was he was poking fun at the myths of his day, But it was also at the point where people were starting to ask that question around what is fact, what is fiction. So in Lucian's story, you have travel to other worlds, you have aliens, you have a lot of the things that we would see as your basic tropes of science fiction. So it had a very early start within people's thinking. And then you move on from there, sort of 13th century to the 15th century. You have stories like the Arabian Nights that start incorporating science fiction elements. And then we take that jump to Frankenstein, which is recognised as the formalisation of what we would call modern science fiction. The other thing that I like during this period is when you think about the function of cultural mythology. And Aaron touched on this at the start of his talk, and I was worried that he was going to do my talk for me, but he didn't, which was nice. So, the function of all cultural mythology is to answer three basic questions. First question is who I am or why I live. So what is the purposeful nature of my existence? The other one, which sci-fi spent a lot of time on and which was a very core focus of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is why must we die? Why is it that our existence is so fragile, so finite? And what can we do to extend beyond the boundaries of that? Who actually has control life over death? Is it something that humanity can conquer? Can we pierce the veil? The majority, though, of cultural mythology and a lot of popular culture deals with what's up with all this stuff that happens in the middle between birth and death. How do I find love? Why is life so difficult? What does it mean to have a significant role in my family, in my community? So all cultural mythologies, Christianity included, tries to provide an answer to these questions. What Christianity does is it anchors all those in Christ. As Aaron pointed out, very firmly anchors them in Christ. And often when we're having that dialogue, or when I'm chatting to people about popular culture and Christianity and mythology, something that often comes up is this thought of the definite nature of Christianity. So there's no wriggle room, it's that sense of Jesus is the answer. I'm sorry if that offends, but for Christianity that is the answer. Whereas Aaron pointed out, cultural mythology, it tries to provide other answers or responses to that. So Victor Frankenstein, and it's even though Frankenstein sort of treads between sci-fi and horror, in the early stages of the book, as Victor Frankenstein is recounting his story, we find a very young, romantic, philosophical figure who is trying to unravel the mysteries of life and the universe. And he spends some time in philosophy. He ends up studying chemistry quite in depth. And he believes that he has cracked the secret of life. And he very much goes through that process of understanding the consequences between sort of life, existence, and the soul. The sci-fi genre, we were having this chat early. It is very hard to sort of pin down exactly what the sci-fi genre is, but most of us recognise it when we encounter it. So, one of the early, does anyone know what the picture on the trip to the moon? Sorry? Very good. Regarded as the first sort of formalised science fiction movie. War of the Worlds. Does anyone remember the social event that accompanied War of the Worlds when it was first released as a radio play?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, down the back.
There was allegedly a widespread panic because they thought it was a real thing happening. The news broadcast didn't actually
Yeah. So there's that thing around War of the Worlds. There was all this hype that came around it. And it was an interesting moment when, through the medium of science fiction, it grasped people's popular interest, even though the accounts of the panic were inflated. It grasped people's consciousness. 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Any chance anyone's read this recently? Excellent, well done. A core part of the science fiction genre when it started out, or when it was formalising, in sort of the 1920s to 1950s, was trying to explore the implications of the science of the day. So there are whole pages in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that are devoted to the mechanics of how the Nautilus works, the depths, the pressures, the physical mechanics of it. A lot of modern science fiction doesn't really touch on that. Interstellar is a great example. We just sort of accept that there is a fifth dimensional tesseract that lets him basically sort of play a harpsichord of gravity behind his daughter's bookcase. And by and large, we are happy to do that because we're at the point now where science fiction has become so expansive in its scope, we are much more ready to suspend our belief than we were back in the early 1920s or 1930s, where that line between fact and fiction was very important to people. The other thing that sci-fi genre does really well, which Aaron also raised, was this thing around providing an alternate view of the meaning of life, or where the meaning of life sits. And you think about the premise of Frankenstein. Victor very much is trying to pierce the veil between life and death. But as he goes through, he becomes more and more horrified at what he has created as being ugly. Both physically and emotionally, he sees the creature as an ugly creation, which is quite a contradiction to the way that God sees humanity, even in our brokenness. So God doesn't approve of sin, he doesn't overlook our sin, but he very much sees us through the lens of the cross. So we are beautiful in God's sight. And it's interesting that Victor very much takes that opposite view of his creation. Whoops. The nature of existence. Over the last probably 5-10 years, the amount of movies preoccupied with artificial intelligence have been on the rise. Has anyone noticed that? There is Ex Machina, Automata, Chappie. Chappie is one of my favourites because you have this wonderful reversal through the movie where Chappie sort of takes on the role of creator protector over his maker, which is a fascinating concept to explore. The other thing that is coming out more and more is this sense of humanity's origins lie beyond the stars. So the Earth was seeded at some point by another race, and so you can basically throw out all of existing world cultures, mythologies and beliefs because we were all seeded here at some point by another race. Something that the Stargate series, which is a little bit back in the day now, but Stargate did that very well, providing that alternate explanation for how life arrived on Earth. So when you look at the symbols that we have up there, we have Frankenstein, man's attempt to pierce the veil of death. We have one of the architects or makers from Prometheus, the origin of life exists somewhere other than God. And we have Chappie as that representation of consciousness as being something other than distinctly or uniquely human. And the thing that I have always enjoyed, well, I've enjoyed in the recent movies, and something that comes up in Altered Carbon, is where does the soul actually reside? Is it in the consciousness? Is it something more ephemeral? What is it that makes us human? There's an interesting twist within a lot of the artificial intelligent movies that are coming out recently, where you have the created, so you have Chappie becomes the superior life form. Has anyone seen, there's a Spanish directed movie, Automata, with Antonio Banderas in the lead? Yeah. So you have this artificial intelligence comes into being, and then in response to humanity's persecution, they basically go out in the desert and wait for the human race to die off. And it's like, we'll be here around after you. We don't need to fight you. We don't need to win a political argument. We're just going to quietly wait for you to all die off and come back and take over. And it's that wonderful thing that sort of comes through our social consciousness around that sense of, are we inherently doomed? Are we inherently doomed, and are we likely to either be the author of our doom, or are we likely to create the solution? And something I want to have a quick chat about at the end is, what would it mean if we actually left the planet? When we think about humanity's stewardship over the earth, when we think about one of the first things that God asked us to do, what would it mean if we abandoned the planet because we had wrecked it and moved on somewhere else? Does anyone have any questions so far? Excellent. The tangible other. The reason why I picked from Shelley to Spielberg as my bookends, Shelley very much exploring what is life, something that came out, E.T. is one of my favourites, saw it in the drive-in, stayed awake for the whole movie, which was quite a feat given my age. And it was one of those times when you could still get like the crunch bars and no one cared about how much sugar you were feeding kids. It was a wonderful time to go to the movies. I miss it deeply. Something that comes out in the way that Spielberg represents E.T. is this benevolent alien figure who is willing to essentially forgive the persecution that he faces, forms these really meaningful relationships, and just wants to go home. And E.T. has that. Has anyone seen Paul? Yeah, when Paul's on the phone to Spielberg and he's like, well, you could give him something messianic, and he talks about, not going too far with it. But there's this lovely thing that E.T. provides some of those answers around healing and are we alone in the universe, and what would other life look like? And he's a very benign, gentle figure. But what it does is it starts trying to answer that question of, are we alone in the universe? What would life look like? How would they relate to us? Has anyone ever encountered someone who was unwilling or reluctant to engage with God because they weren't sure how God was going to respond to them? There's this unknown element to the concept of God for non-Christians which can be quite jarring, can be quite striking. What this sense of the tangible other, of otherness, does is it lets us take those fears, it lets us take those musings, and we wrap it in a shape. It's E.T. as the kind figure. It's the tripods from the War of the Worlds as the great enemy. But what it does, as in any mythology tries to do, is describe God in a way that people can get their heads around and people can control. Anyone see the recent Independence Day movie? A couple of people. Did anyone see the original? Yes. Excellent. Anyone seen a movie recently where a race of aliens really should have wiped us out in the first 5-10 minutes of the film?
Yeah, Battleship.
I've lost the name of the film. That doesn't happen often. Can't have been that remarkable. There are quite a few movies that have come out come out recently where you look at it and you go, really, the aliens should have wiped us out in the first 5 minutes, and that should have been the end of the movie. At the recent Independence Day, like the mothership is basically the size of 2 or 3 continents. The weight of it resting on the Earth should have created sufficient natural disasters to wipe out all organic life. It's like, forget that. You can imagine the Queen's driving up in the ship. Do we dispense the troops? We won't need to. We won't need to. We're just going to park it somewhere over Europe, and that'll do the trick. But inevitably what we do is create these scenarios where humanity rises up and defeats the great evil. So we take these fears, we take these anxieties, and we craft them into something controllable. I would argue that one of the great offences with Christianity is that Jesus refuses to be controlled. God needs nothing from us, but he wants our love. God doesn't need us to sustain him, but he provides everything we need for sustenance. He is, in the truest sense of the word, unassailable. And so much of science fiction tries to take that sense of awe and wonder and feed back to us that sense of that we can control it, we can overcome it, we can defeat it, contain it, analyse it. And that is something that theology and that Jesus resists. I will not be tamed by you. When we think about, is anyone actively involved in sort of youth ministry or missions, or a few people in the room? 3 core things that, as takeaways, as potential starting points for your culture theology dialogue. As Aaron touched on, the nature of the soul, what does it mean to be human? And there's an interesting extension of that, which is, if we were to create life, let's say that as a group we were all smart enough to create an artificial intelligence. Is that artificial intelligence, is that bestowed with our fallen nature because it was made by fallen beings? Would we inevitably create something that is so much a reflection of us that it would carry that sense of hurt? Is it actually philosophically possible for a fallen humanity to create something that is perfect? And what you pick up in a lot of the artificial intelligence movies is this sense of humanity creates the perfect being that either decides that we are no longer necessary or protects us and guides us into a utopian future. But could we actually do that? Could humanity actually ever take that step and create something that was free of sin? It is an interesting thing to ponder. My personal favourite, and it's something I'm going to start working on next. What happens shortly after creation? What is God's instruction to Adam and Eve? Sorry? Yeah. Be fruitful, work the earth, multiply. You are stewards over this space. It is creation with a purpose. Human beings were not designed to be in hammocks sipping pina coladas as much as we like that view of paradise. We were created with a purpose to tend, to care, to multiply. What does it say about our stewardship if we ever left a planet as a charred heap of rubble? I'm all for interplanetary travel. Don't get me wrong, I would love to go see a space alien. That would be one of my things. That and teleportation, providing all of me gets to the other point. But what would it mean for our stewardship? What would it mean for our relationship with the planet that God has given us for us to abandon it? Do we have that right? Do we have that freedom? Is it our choice to discard the planet and move on to another one? Are we obliged to tend and care for it because this was the haven that God gave us? What is man's relationship between creation? Or are we at the point where humanity no longer cares about the earth because we're intending to leave it as soon as possible? there are all these amazing threads that come out of those discussions, which you can broach with people on a way that is attached to the gospel, but is non-messianic. And I'm just going to touch on that briefly when I close. The other is the great evil. Where does the great evil actually rest? Will we be wiped out by a continent-sized spaceship? Will they come out of the ocean as though they've always been here? Where does the great evil rest? And increasingly we project it out to the stars. Humanity is basically okay. We're basically on track. The greatest evil, the true evil, exists beyond the scope of our experience. It's not us, it's them. Which again I think is a really interesting way for us to use, that sci-fi is used to alleviate us of that responsibility, of that thinking. Don't panic and carry a towel. Just in closing, I just wanted to... I'll put my pen down somewhere, that's all right.
It's on the stand.
On the stand? Oh, look at that. Just couldn't see it for the little lid. Often what we do when we look at narratives is we become really focused on one person, the actions of one character. And there are times when that works really well. Something that I'd like to put out for your thinking as we go away from here is fictional narratives are encompassed by a universe. And what often science fiction does is it creates a universe without a God in it, or a defined spirituality. And when we think about engaging with culture around these themes, I would argue that, say, let's, Neo from the Matrix. Lots of messianic imagery in there, but there are a lot of other things happening in that film that has some really good dialogue points to it. My argument is that no fictional narrative, no central character can carry the weight of being Christ-like. It will inevitably break down over time. And the reason for that is when you walk backwards, you find that the character has so many failings, so many faults, you can create this confused picture of who Jesus is or what Christianity is, what we're actually trying to represent. Whereas if you look at the broader narrative, what you find is you have all these wonderful points of intersection where questions like, what is our responsibility to the planet? What is our responsibility to each other? What is my brokenness? How do we feel about a God who refuses to be contained? You can often engage in the dialogue to a really significant degree without needing to start with all superheroes are Christ-like or the messianic nature of a particular figure. There's nothing wrong with that, and you can do it. But the thing I want to leave us with this morning is there is so much more that sci-fi has to offer in terms of these dialogues. And let's not lose that sense of the whole narrative of what's actually going on. So that's me done. Any questions? Excellent, well done. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. And I should have...